Just before we started, I have to tell you about a service that you've probably never heard of before, and that would be Squarespace. Obviously, I'm kidding. Everyone knows about Squarespace, and that's because they're the absolute best place to build a website in 2022, and also because, well, you've seen me talk about it many times in ads. But seriously, if you do need a website, there's no point considering anyone else. If you thought, I need a website for my business, blog, annoying political opinions, whatever, you must head to Squarespace. Why? Because websites are ridiculously easy to make with Squarespace, and they're also feature-rich. Imagine this situation. You know nothing about websites. You love looking at them. You know there are some that look pretty and work well. And now imagine you have some need for this website. Well, nowadays, with Squarespace, you can make it. Easily. Just like that. And Squarespace doesn't just do things like blogs, which they do beautifully, by the way. You can also sell things through Squarespace, which, is a good thing if you want to have a business and all. Or maybe you just want to sell memberships to your online cat yoga class. Look, it's all possible. It's not all sensible, it's just all possible. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/brainfood to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now today's video. This shouldn't come as any surprise given the mortality rates of women giving birth throughout most of humans humaning. Pregnancy prevention around the world has a lengthy history that includes many surprisingly effective but occasionally lethal methods of contraception. Early contraceptive options offered an array of colourful, creative, and in some cases incredibly gross choices that included innovative options in barrier devices, spermicides, and oral contraceptives. Beyond these devices and substances, one of the oldest known methods still in use and relatively popular today was coitus interruptus, aka pull and pray or withdrawal, with the earliest documented use of this being found in the Bible and a story estimated to have been written about 2,500 years ago. This was the tale of Onan, who was supposed to be getting his brother's widow Tamar pregnant to provide an heir for his deceased sibling. Instead, he simply had sex with her and withdrew, spilling his seed on the ground to make sure she wouldn't get pregnant. Fascinatingly, despite this story pretty explicitly being about Onan not doing his duty to get his brother's widow pregnant to continue his brother's line, this oddly, in some circles, became more about saying that masturbation, or otherwise, in the general case, spilling your seed outside of a lady's naughty bits, was sinful, and thus any method of contraception was also sinful. Despite the pull and pray method's bad reputation, it turns out as long as you get the pull part right, there really isn't much praying necessary. Among other studies, research done in 2008 at the Guttmacher Institute in New York demonstrated the withdrawal method, when executed perfectly, is 96% effective for preventing pregnancy after a year of romping sample size. This basically means that over the course of a year, 4 out of 100 women who use this method as their primary form of birth control will become pregnant in that year. For comparison, using a condom when done perfectly over that same span is 98% effective, and oral contraception has a perfect use rate of 99.7% effectiveness. And now, this is when all three methods are done perfectly. So what about in actual practice with everyday people? The pull and pray method is roughly 82% effective over the course of a year's usage, while using a condom is roughly 83% effective, so you are only getting a 1% improvement for your money over just raw dogging it. The pill, in contrast, does offer a much better real-world use rate of about 96%, and of course, the pull method puts an awful lot of trust in the guy to do his job there. Nevertheless, for trusting partners and where STIs aren't really a concern, it turns out historically, when talking preventing pregnancy, people have always had something basically as good as condoms at their disposal. And as demonstrated by the story of Onan, humans have long been well aware of this fact. And, of course, performing the withdrawal method perfectly isn't too complex, the withdrawal part being obvious and simply a matter of doing it. That said, there is one way you can still get this part right and mess up. While you might be thinking pre-cum would be the culprit, it turns out studies show pre-cum does not typically contain viable sperm outside of the case of the real problem, residual sperm in the male's urethra from a previous but very recent sexual encounter. This problem can be gotten around simply by the man urinating between sexual encounters, not too complex a thing to get right either. Given its simplicity, it's perhaps unsurprising that previous to the Roman Empire, evidence suggests that the withdrawal method was one of the primary forms of contraception used. This fell out of popularity with the Romans, who seem to have favored other methods available at the time, most of which have been lost to history, but from anecdotal evidence, many of them seem to have been quite effective themselves. One that is known is that they use Queen Anne's lace, which is still occasionally used as a form of contraception in some parts of the world, such as India, and has been shown to have anti-fertility properties. After the fall of the Roman Empire, most methods of contraception fell out of practice in the Western world, at least in terms of what was written down, partially from the influence of Christianity, as Birth control historically was seen as sinful within the church, going back to the story of Onan and all, and perhaps also simply because the knowledge of many of the effective methods was lost. It is generally thought people still popularly used the pull method, even if it wasn't discussed in polite conversation or recorded, and other methods were likewise probably used, even if not written about much. Around the early 19th century, however, documented history shows the pull method saw a huge surge in popularity among societies the world over, and was one of the leading forms of contraception until methods such as the modern condom and the pill were introduced. Today, around 2.5% of the world's population still uses the withdrawal method as the primary method of birth control, and an estimated 52% of people have used it at least once as an intentional method of birth control, rather than just withdrawing for, the other spicy reasons. And speaking of the modern condom, another contraception method that isn't as new as many people think is, the condom. Although early versions of the condom didn't always cover the entire penis, and of course, they certainly weren't made of latex. For example, the first known reference to someone using a condom goes all the way back to about 5,000 years ago to King Minos of Knossos, whose sperm was apparently full of scorpions and serpents. Scorpion sperm was, as you might expect, a problem for delicate ladybirds and resulted in the death of many lovers. The accuracy of his deadly sperm aside, what is more interesting to the story at hand was that to get around the issue, he began using a bladder of a goat as a condom. Also interesting here is that it also appears that even in these earliest references, humans were cognizant of such a condom's disease-spreading preventative attributes. Moving over to our Eastern brethren, lovemaking in Asia often relied on devices called glans condoms, which addressed only the head of the penis. Animal parts were a popular choice for making these condoms. The Chinese fashioned theirs out of lamb intestines, while the Japanese used tortoise shell, called kabutoga, or animal horn, throughout the 1870s. Yes, literally getting horny when horny to prevent the fetal parasite. Now, going back to the animal bits, animal offal is the internal organs and entrails of butchered animals, and not the first thing that comes to mind concerning birth control. But to the Europeans living during the mid-1700s, these organ meats were transformed into their way of preventing babies. Slaughterhouse workers would style early condoms out of sausage skins. Interestingly, Julius Schmidt, the creator of the now infamous Sheik and Ramses brand of condoms, was once a sausage maker who made lamb gut condoms in the 1880s. Yes, wrapping your tool in lamb gut once was the height of birth control technology, and don't even get us started on Pliny the Elder suggesting that to ease the pain and other issues surrounding giving birth, the woman should drink goose jizz mixed with a little water, or honeyed wine mixed with literal cow crap, and say it with me, the past was the worst. Glans condoms were also made out of fabric. There are ancient accounts suggesting early Egyptians living around 1000 BC used linen sheaths during intercourse to protect against disease. In the 16th century, the Europeans also soaked linen sheaths in a chemical solution that was laid out to dry before use. Pieces of the cloth were measured to cover the glands of the penis and later held in place with ribbon. Going back to the 18th century, Gabriele Falloppio, the Italian who prominently described what would become known as the fallopian tube after his namesake, noted these linen sheaths were particularly effective not just at preventing pregnancy but also the spread of diseases such as syphilis, including studying 1,100 men who used such devices and their apparent immunity from contracting syphilis when they did so. Of course, a downside of the linen variety of condom was that they were noted as being much less comfortable than the animal intestine varieties. Perhaps not coincidentally, around this time, as the rise of these types of sheaths became more popular, fertility rates in places they became popular also dropped. It's also known that brothels around this time in Europe began selling such devices for use before partaking in their workers' wares to help protect from disease and pregnancy. Fast forward to one of the crowning achievements of the industrialized world, Charles Goodyear's vulcanization of rubber in 1839 would eventually lead to the creation of the first rubber condom in 1844. Strips of raw rubber were wrapped around penis-shaped molds, which were later dipped in a chemical solution to cure the rubber. With a shelf life of a few months and being very durable, men could actually reuse these particular condoms. In 1912, a new and improved way to manufacture condoms emerged, adding gasoline or benzene to the rubber to liquefy it. The latex condom was officially invented in 1920, and the consumers loved the stronger, thinner material with a shelf life of 5 years. This was all well timed, as just previous to this, soldiers in World War I weren't just dropping like flies from battle, but from their leisure stress reduction activities, bumping uglies with local ladies, and the widespread and rather rampant disease spreading that happened as a result. This is something the invention of the latex condom helped curtail significantly by World War II among soldiers. Inexpensive, easy to use, and effective at preventing the spread of certain diseases, something the withdrawal method doesn't help with much, condoms are now one of the most popular forms of contraception. However, despite the availability of some version of the male condom throughout much of history and the ease and freeness of the withdrawal method, people still chose to find other methods for preventing pregnancy, some of which were not just bizarre but were downright dangerous. Since women were historically viewed as playing a more significant role in getting pregnant, the number of available options for female birth control was much greater and displayed a much higher level of inventiveness. For example, early topical and suppository contraceptives have included olive oil, pomegranate pulp, ginger, and even tobacco juice, which women would smear on and/or inside their vagina as an early spermicide. According to the oldest recorded information regarding birth control, a document that's nearly 4,000 years old, the Egyptian Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, which also happened to be the first known medical text, women used pessaries made out of, we kid you not, crocodile dung and honey as a form of contraception. In hindsight, it was pretty smart to combine animal feces with a very effective antibacterial substance like honey, and indeed it's also thought certain Native American tribes used honey for this same contraceptive purpose, a literal honeypot. Noteworthy is that honey isn't just antibacterial, but also does this via the production of hydrogen peroxide when encountering moisture, which no doubt all helped as well as a mild spermicide. Going back to the Egyptians, in addition to physically preventing sperm from fertilizing an egg, the acidic properties of the dung may have served as an effective spermicide. In India, relevant dung has been used in the same manner, because, well, who doesn't want to shove poop up your naughty bits and then go to town on said bits? Another method the text describes on top of the crocodile dung was the use of acacia gum, which is much less mentally repulsive to put in one's hoo-ha and indeed does work as a spermicide. It can even be found in some spermicide products today, unlike crocodile dung. Fast forward a few thousand years, and in 1832, Dr. Charles Knowlton popularized the method of syringe douching as a method of contraception, and throughout the US, women would use his douching mixtures comprised of vinegar, zinc sulfide, and liquid chloride to prevent pregnancy. It wasn't until after 1850 that hard rubber syringes came into play. Before that, early syringes were made out of horn, bone, or pewter. Douching kits and solutions were sold during the greater part of the 1900s. At one time, American women painfully turned to the popular household disinfectant Lysol as a method of contraception. From the 1930s through the 1960s, the Lysol disinfectant douche was a top seller in feminine hygiene products. However, not only did the Lysol douche later prove ineffective as a spermicide, but its use also led to toxic effects such as inflammation, irritation, and burning sensations of the vagina and cervix. Getting away from Lysol, the first commercially produced birth control pill called Endovid-10 made an appearance on the market in 1960, just before the FDA approved the use of synthetic progesterone and estrogen in pill form that works to prevent ovulation in women. The market offered female pills with oftentimes unidentified ingredients or questionable herbal concoctions used to induce or speed up menstrual flow as a way to provoke a miscarriage. As for the first use of intrauterine devices, this dates back to the Middle Ages when Arab Bedouins would insert pebbles into the uteruses of their camels to prevent pregnancy during long desert journeys. The pebbles caused a mild infection in the uterus that affected the fertilization and implantation of eggs. As for humans, it wasn't until the 1960s in the US that the IUD was an acceptable form of birth control for women. Over time, IUDs have been made out of suture materials, coiled metal wire, stainless steel, plastic, rubber, copper wire, and silver filaments, all proving extremely effective at their quasi-goalkeeping abilities. Going back a bit with substances, in the mid-19th century, preparations of loose herbs such as pennyroyal, rue, hellebore, mistletoe, foxglove, Queen Anne's lace, blue root, ergot, and different mint plants were steeped in hot water like a cup of tea or dissolved in alcohol before consumption. While herbs such as tansy and pennyroyal may have had a reputation for possessing abortive properties, they also worked by poisoning the women. Going back much further with the liquid birth control concoctions, it was also an unfortunate habit of early physicians to use chemical-laden drinks that blended lethal substances like arsenic, mercury, and strychnine with grains, fruits, and oils. Early physicians would suggest women drink the poisonous mixtures as a way to disrupt their reproductive systems, usually in very controlled dosages so as to prevent pregnancy without killing the woman, often though inducing a miscarriage if a fertilized egg is present. For instance, Soranus, a Greek gynecologist practicing during the 2nd century AD, told women to drink the water the blacksmith used to cool metal as a birth control method. About 500 years before this, Hippocrates recommended copper ore be used as an effective birth control method, demonstrating that even the ancients had made the connection between copper and contraception, something that the aforementioned modern IUDs rely on. In 900 BC, Chinese birth control experts advised women to swallow 16 tadpoles fried in quicksilver, mercury, immediately immediately after sex. Successful results that came from drinking toxic remedies sometimes came with damage to the liver, kidneys, and other major organs. Some women would never again have children in the future, becoming sterile, or worse, they would die. In both cases, we guess the methods were indeed super effective at preventing unwanted childbirth. Although, don't get us started on the curious phenomenon of coffin births, but okay, we'll talk about it a bit in the bonus facts. Not every oral or liquid contraceptive method was deadly, although perhaps the effectiveness is questionable. Acidic fruits and vegetables often played a role in early birth control. To prevent a pregnancy, Arabian women would eat mashed pomegranates mixed with rock salt and alum. During the 1400s, drinking raw onion juice was a trick of the Italians. In 1600, the French ate cabbage after intercourse. Not so sure about the effectiveness there, maybe a connection made via listeria and its abortive properties. Whatever the case, it was certainly a thing. On the other side, one of the most effective and safe liquid remedies for birth control was most likely lemon juice as a topical remedy. Specifically, to create a physical barrier in the vagina, women would insert soft wool soaked in vinegar or lemon juice to prevent pregnancy, and serves as an example of an early form of the cervical cap with a form of spermicide naturally baked in. Another seemingly very effective birth control method used by the ancient Greeks and Romans was the silphium plant, which is now unfortunately extinct, and became so because of its extreme popularity for medicinal purposes, mainly for birth control. Why it became extinct when it was more valuable than silver was because of failure after failure to try and grow it away from its natural habitat of a small stretch of land in what is now Libya. Because of the small area it could be grown successfully and the extreme demand, by the 2nd century BC, the plant went the way of the dodo, ironically losing its evolutionary reproductive battle because of its supposed ability to stop reproduction in another living thing. As to how it was used is not fully understood, but it appears its leaves were ground up and drunk in some sort of way, with evidence pointing to its abortive effects. In the end, we've come a long way from the near 4,000-year-old method of crocodile dung and honey, and even the more modern method of Lysol douching. But it's surprising to see that so many ancient methods for birth control seem to have been remarkably effective, and some, such as the basic withdrawal method, are still chugging along today as an effective means of birth control. So, if we take anything from this, it's that apparently, from the beginning of humans humaning, we've been trying to have our cake and eat it too in regards to sex and preventing our human fetal parasites. Bonus facts. When you die, your body is, in a quite real sense, never more alive. Beyond the amazing number of microbes that already call your body home, now thriving to a level your immune system was previously preventing, more of their cells than your own at any given time, by the way, other bacteria and varying fungi and fauna colonize the body with great rapidity after death. As the body becomes biome, flesh undergoes a dreadful pantomime of balloon animal elasticity, swelling, bloating, distorting. This dance macabre is quite likely not what one has in mind when one hears of life after death. However, these commonplace morbidities of life and death pale in comparison to one of the more unusual and completely tragic graveyard phenomena: post-mortem fetal extrusion, aka coffin birth, where the dead mother gives birth after the fact to an equally dead baby. Historical texts bear this gruesome curiosity out with a clinical chill. In 1551, one of the earliest known documented cases of coffin birth was recorded. A victim of the Spanish Inquisition, swinging at the gallows, gave birth hours after her execution. In 1633, a Brussels woman who died in labor convulsions gave post-mortem birth 3 days later. In 1650, a parish register noted, April the 20th, 1650, was buried M, the wife of Thomas Toplace, who was found delivered of a child after she had lain 2 hours in the grave. In 1677, another woman died in labor. 6 hours later, abdominal movements were observed, and still 18 hours after that, her deceased child was born. In 1861, 60 hours after a woman died in convulsions, she gave birth to her 8-month-old baby. The idea of post-mortem birth has been recognized as both a mythological notion and a medical possibility for centuries. Indeed, the Greek god of medicine, Asclepius, was cut from his mother's womb after she was killed upon Mount Olympus. The earthly heirs of Asclepius, medical professionals of yore, made common practice of opening the bodies of dead pregnant women, aware that live birth was still possible if they were fast enough. Indeed, the Catholic Church, intent upon delivering children from the purgatory of death before baptism, supported this as church doctrine. Priests were called upon to perform the post-mortem caesarean on pain of excommunication. At times, some physicians didn't even bother to wait for the mother to die if it seemed absolutely certain that she would do so anyway, further helping to ensure the survival of the child. But this is the morbid tale of when the baby is not cut out. So what happens then? Well, dead bodies decompose. This process involves the diminution of oxygen, which in turn is accompanied by the multiplication of anaerobic bacteria, which leads to a buildup of gases like carbon dioxide and methane created on breakdown of the body. The gases cause the body to swell up significantly. It is those gases which perform a similar role to the contractions that a woman experiences during normal childbirth. The increased volume of gases in the deceased pushes on the uterus, forcing the dead fetus through the vagina and occasionally also forcing the uterus itself to prolapse out. Thus, through the decomposition of the dead, a gruesome birth is simulated, hence the term coffin birth. Given that all it potentially takes for a coffin birth to happen is the death of a pregnant woman where saving the baby isn't attempted, well, why don't we hear about these coffin births today? Not beyond cremations, this is primarily due to the ubiquity of embalming the dead. Chemicals used to preserve the body and make it presentable slow down decomposition and flush the normal bodily fluids and a significant number of microbes away. The result is removal of many of the elements that are so instrumental to coffin births, making them an extremely rare occurrence in modern times. Rare, however, is not never, and documented coffin births do still occasionally happen. To end on a slightly less morbid note, and here we'll emphasize slightly, not all post-mortem deliveries result in the death of the baby, though these are then technically not classified as post-mortem fetal extrusion. Such was the case of a 23-year-old woman in India in 2007. After contractions started, she killed herself, but her body ultimately completed the birth of the infant naturally, a rare example of post-mortem delivery. The baby was later found alive and still attached to the dead mother's body, an instance where life and death had a truly tragic connection.